Welcome back, dear students, to yet another lecture on the history of English language and literature. And in our lecture today, we shall discuss about the movement poetry of the 1950s, and we shall also introduce three poets, Philip Larkin, Ted Hughes, and Carol Ann Duffy. So we shall have an introductory discussion about the movement poetry. We have learned about the socio-political situation of early 20th century England in our previous lectures. The two world wars proved to be traumatic for the entire world and especially for Great Britain. The poetry of the early part of the 20th century was dominated by the Victorian poets, and we have learned about Tennyson, Browning, Matthew Arnold, etc. We also have learned about the modernist poetry that flourished in the 1930s. Between the wars, the post-war life of Britain in the late 40s and 1950s were struggles to return to normal life after being crippled by the world wars. The 1950s witnessed the emergence of a new kind of poets or new kind of poetry, the poets who desired to build England into a welfare society and a classless society. The poetry of the 1950s is known as the movement poetry. The movement was a term coined by J.D. Scott in 1954. J.D. Scott. He was a literary editor of the Spectator. This genre of poetry, the movement poetry, was a reaction to the poetry of the 1930s and the 40s. The movement poetry was a gathering of poets like Kingsley Amis, Davy, John Wain, Thom Gunn, Philip Larkin, Ted Hughes, Elizabeth Jennings, etc. Now, the most prominent of the movement poets were Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis. None of these poets had any common ideology. There is nothing that grouped them together. Now, each one was composing poems by himself. The movement poetry was a reaction to the modernist poetry, as I said, that was excessively concerned with rules, that was excessively concerned with the minor details, and which was highly intellectual. We have learned about modernism and modernist poetry. The modernist poetry of the poets like T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound was highly intellectual and used allusions. Now, this characteristic made the modernist poetry quite unintelligible to ordinary people. Now, the modernist poetry was highbrow intellectual poetry with intertextual references and allusions, we can say. Now, the modernist poetry displaced so one accusation level against the modernist poetry is that it displaced and rejected the traditions of English poetic canons with this quest for experimentation. The stress was given to experimentation, the call for make new. So the traditional canons were rejected. The movement poetry tried to reinstate these traditions. So the movement poetry will try to reinstate these traditions. Now they try to go back to the traditions. Now, according to the movement, the poetry should return to the 18th century Augustan age and should treat modernism as an aberration. So they were against modernist poetry. They wanted to revive the old classical traditions or return back to the traditions. They rejected the modernist poetry. The movement poets considered the excess themes and stylistic devices of the modernist poetry as bad principles. The movement poets were determined to avoid these bad principles. They tried to make the poetry appealing and intelligible to everyone by using the language of everyday life. And according to the modern movement poets, a poet is an ordinary man, like the man next door, who is very common and lives in a common place. The poet is a common man. The poet has nothing special, nothing heroic about his deeds. The movement poets wanted the poets to always focus on the day-to-day experiences. The movement poets believed that the poem should suit leisurely reading. They also believed that the poem should be free of allusion and should be easy for common man to read, to understand and enjoy. For the members of the movement, the poetry meant simple, sensuous content and undignified form. The movement poetry was anti-romantic, anti-form and anti-sentimental, unsentimental. They wanted to replace formal words and obscure meaning. So formal words and obscure meaning, that should be replaced. It was urbane as well. The subject matter of the movement poetry was events and objects of everyday life. They used the commonplace language and rejected the complexities of the modernists. The movement poets helped the poetry to reach a wider readership. The movement poetry tried to present the problems of the educated middle class. So the problems of the educated middle class and those of the contemporary period were presented in the movement poetry. Though the movement poetry presented the problems of the educated middle class and contemporary life, it had no solution to offer. So the poetry of the common man. The movement poets used the traditional verse forms, usually the iambic pentameter, and the stanza form and rhyme was used. The call of the modernist was make new, but the movement poetry focused on the traditional forms. It is not quite easy to generalize the form and style of the movement poetry. Any generalization might prove to be a failure. But the following can be talked about as the characteristics of the movement poetry. 1. The movement poetry embraces a return to the form. A return to the form. It was a reaction against the fragmentation of form begun by the modernists. So, movement poetry embraces a return to the form. The second characteristic that we can remember about the movement poetry is that the movement poetry has the straightforward representation of the self. Straightforward representation of the self. The modernist poetry presented the illuminated individual, the individual who is cut off from the society. Now here we have the straightforward representation of the self. Thirdly, while the modernist poetry embraced experimentalism, the movement poetry preferred the conventional forms of the previously established poetic genres. So modernism focused on experimentation. Here we have the return to the previously established poetic genres. Fourthly, movement poetry did not abandon the structure. They embraced the structures. Fifthly, the movement poetry reflected the reality of the ordinary, the reality of the mundane, day-to-day realistic society. They avoided high symbolism and mysticism, and they used the plain language in the poems. The drawback of the movement poetry was that the subject matter of the movement poetry was very often quite trivial, silly, simple. Now we shall now talk about some of the two other important movement poets. They are Philip Larkin and Ted Hughes. And in our class today we shall also discuss and talk about Carol Ann Duffy, though she does not belong to the category of the movement poets. So we will talk about three poets: Philip Larkin, Ted Hughes and Carol Ann Duffy. Now let us first talk about, have an introduction about this great movement poet, Philip Larkin. Now Philip Larkin was born in London in 1922. He graduated from St. John's College, Oxford. He went on to do professional studies to become a librarian and worked in libraries for his entire life. So he was a librarian. He studied library course and he worked as a librarian. Now, Philip Larkin was the most prominent of the movement poets. He tried to make English poetry intelligent and comprehensible. So we are learning Philip Larkin, who is the most or one of the most important or prominent poets of the movement group. When we learn about Larkin, we need to learn the influences of Larkin. Who were the poets or people who influenced Philip Larkin? Larkin was influenced by W.B. Yeats. Now this is evident from the collection of his poems, The North Ship, which was published in 1945. The most immediate effect of Yeats on Larkin is seen here, which is the romanticism that appears in The North Ship. but he grew out of the influence of W.B. Yeats. So there was an element of romanticism in the poems of Philip Larkin in the beginning, that is influence from W.B. Yeats. Larkin soon rejected the influence of Yeats and turned for inspiration to the poetry of Thomas Hardy. He would turn anti-romantic. So he started with romanticism, romantic values. Now he is anti-romantic. The major themes of Philip Larkin's poems are: first, England was one of his major themes. England. We have learned that with urbanization, the cities began to develop and the countryside began to slowly disappear. Now there was much focus on building the cities, and Larkin expresses a deep sense of loss of the English countryside. So he talks about London. His theme is London. What is his feeling? A sense of loss of the English countryside. The second theme that often appears in Larkin's poems are, he also wrote about the ordinary happenings around us, ordinary happenings. As a keen observer, he would observe everything happening around him, and an ordinary reader could easily associate with his poems. Now what about the style of Larkin? Larkin is considered as a realistic poet, realist. His poems are very close to reality. The poems also appear in the conversational tone, colloquial words. Colloquial words are employed in the poetry, and it makes his poems very easy to understand, comprehensible. He always reflected the common man's themes, and he is known as the laureate of the common man. His poems have a mature style and is intelligible. Intelligible meant that the reader could easily understand and connect with the poem. It is said that Larkin was a literary nihilist. He was a literary nihilist who was incapable of seeing anything enjoyable in human life. So pessimism was part of his poetry. This pessimism was characteristic of the movement poetry as well. So there is this pessimistic elements also in the poems of Philip Larkin. Larkin's poetry is noted for the originality of subject matter. Originality of the subject matter, regular stanzaic forms, careful diction and artful syntax. So originality of subject matter, regular stanzaic forms, careful diction and artful syntax. The collections of the poetry of Larkin are: first, The Night Ship, which was published in 1945, Church Going, which he completed in 1954, The Less Deceived, that came out in 1955, New Lines, that came in 1956, The Whitsun Weddings, that came in 64, High Windows, that came in 1974, and Collected Poems, that was published in 1988. So that is in short about Philip Larkin, the movement poet, the most important movement poet, his style, his themes, and some of the collection of his poems. Now we shall talk about another movement poet called Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes, who lived from 1930 to 1999. Ted Hughes was an English poet who belonged to the movement group. Now, he was a translator and children's writer as well. He is regarded by critics as one of the best poets of his generation. He was the poet laureate from 1984 till his death, poet laureate. He was married to Sylvia Plath, another important literary figure, from 1956 until her suicide in 1963. We know Sylvia Plath committed suicide. Sylvia Plath was an American poet. So Ted Hughes was the husband of Sylvia Plath. His first collection of poems, Hawk in the Rain, was published in 1957. Now this collection speaks of his boyhood experiences of fishing and shooting in his native Yorkshire. His other collections include Lupercal, that came in 1960, Vodvo, that came in 1967, Craw in 1970, and Birthday Letter, that came in 1999. Ted Hughes studied anthropology and archaeology, and he worked as a rose gardener, as a night watchman, a zoo attendant, and even as a school teacher. Now, his finest poems describe animals. The poems of Ted Hughes give the feel of the physical presence of animals with their natural strength and power. So we can feel the presence of animals in his poems. He describes animals using bold metaphors and dramatic physical language. We can feel their presence. He saw nature as threatening and harsh, as immoral and violent nature. By examining these ruthless, instinctive behavior of animals, he revealed the distance between human civilization and primitive civilizations. That isn't just about Ted Hughes. We should also talk about Carol Ann Duffy. Carol Ann Duffy was born in 1905 to Scottish parents. She was a professor of contemporary poetry in Manchester Metropolitan University. She became the poet laureate in 2009. She was the first woman poet and the first Scottish-born poet to hold the position of the poet laureate in England. She was the first female poet also to hold the position of the poet laureate. She is also the first LGBT to become a poet laureate. LGBT stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender. So she is the first LGBT person to become the poet laureate. Carol Ann Duffy was a lesbian poet. Her poems have a strong feminist edge. Now we are talking about feminism, the three waves of feminism, etc. Now her poems have a strong feminist edge. Gender, oppression and violence are the themes that concerns her. All these are presented in her poems. Carol Ann Duffy depicts the everyday experience of her life and that of others in an easily accessible language. What are some of the best known collections of Duffy? They are the following. In 1985 she would publish Standing Nude. 1987 Selling Manhattan came out. 1993 Meantime. 2002 Feminist Gospel, and in 2005 we have Rupture. It is to be noted that the love poems of Duffy are in the form of monologues. The collections of Duffy, The World's Wife, that came in 1999, is a subversion of myth and history. Now this collection takes the characters, stories, histories and myths which focus on men, and in Duffy's renowned feminist way, and she presents them anew for the public to look at the women that were previously obscured behind the man, the women who were obscured, hidden behind the man. In it she expresses the view of the women behind the famous male figures like Pilate, Sisyphus, Freud and Charles Darwin, etc. So she was a lesbian poet, she was a strong feminist. My dear students, in our lecture today we have considered the movement poetry. The poets of the 1950s are called as this movement group. We also have discussed what are some of the important characteristics of the movement poets, how they were angry or against the modernist poets, and they were anti-romantic. We have talked about two important movement poets, Philip Larkin and Ted Hughes, and we have also mentioned about Carol Ann Duffy, who is the first woman poet laureate of England. We have mentioned the works of these three poets, and for your assignment, please write a summary of our class today, the movement poetry. Please also mention the works and the themes and characteristics of the poets Philip Larkin, Ted Hughes and Carol Ann Duffy. Thank you for your patient listening. Have a nice time. Please stay safe at home. Thank you.